All right, Adam, let's go ahead and step up to our next version.
Absolutely. Let's go to the bigger shells in the artillery here. This is going to be moving into our Knob Creek territory, and Knob Creek is 100 proof bourbon and rye. We make these whiskeys to be big and bold. This is harkened back to whiskey or bourbons around the turn of the century when the Bottle and Bond Act was sort of informing that the good stuff, the authentic bourbon, would be about 100 proof on the dot, and just have bigger, bolder flavor. And Knob Creek to me is what I drink the most of. I know I'm not supposed to have favorites necessarily, but really I gravitate towards Knob Creek bourbon and our different ages. Most of the time that I'm enjoying a bourbon at home or out in the bar when we did those sort of things, and we're doing those sort of things again now. But to me, Knob Creek is a quintessential bourbon. When I think about quintessence, I think about your sweetness coming from vanillas and caramels, and you have a little bit of the oaky notes, and you have some spice, and then you have that quintessence of what I call the Kentucky hug, which is that flavor, that feeling that you get in your chest after drinking a big bourbon. And Knob Creek has all five of those things. But I was sort of, as I mentioned earlier with the blue cheese pairing, I really kind of wanted to try and figure out if I could engineer how to save the blue cheese for last, knowing that that's always got some of the bigger flavors, and knowing that our bigger, bolder bourbon and rye might kind of serve that journey or that narrative a little bit better. But for me, this is where we start to have a lot of fun. Like, I think that we had really great, just unilateral kismet coming together with those two first flights. And now I think we start to kind of see like how we can play off of each other a little bit with how I was kind of going with how our recommendations sort of synced up. So with Knob Creek, what you're going to get is a lot of traditional classic bourbon flavors, and to speak in like generalities and the big brush strokes, it's deep dark golden, almost amber color inside the glass here. It's going to be 9 years old, the better part of a decade. You really get a lot of great color and a huge depth of aroma and flavor from the aging. Again, this is one of those small batch bourbons. This is our most popular small batch bourbon. We've been doing this for almost 30 years now. This is, again, one of Booker Noe's creations, and really the bourbon that Fred Noe, his son, took on the road with his dad when they were promoting the original small batch collection and turning people on to small batch bourbons. Because at the turn of the 1980s and the 1990s, when they were introducing this collection, which is Booker's, Baker's, Knob Creek, and Basil Hayden, people weren't drinking a lot of bourbon. And so for Booker to be on the road promoting this whiskey, it really started to, it's one of those hallmark products, one of those hallmark moments that help usher in bourbon back into the favor of the American drinking populace. Because due to prohibition and some societal cultural revolutions and happened and enlightenment that happened, a lot of people kind of moved away from bourbon and became more cosmopolitan people of the planet, and drank spirits from all over, not just what we were drinking here as what we produce in the US. So it's been great to see us go back to drinking so much bourbon again as Americans, and rye and American whiskey. But that's really only been happening for the better part of the last 10 years, 15 years, depending on where you live and where you've been. And so when these guys were out there talking, when Booker and Fred were out there talking about this whiskey, people were putting down their martinis to try this. And it was awesome for them to kind of be turned on by these big, bold American flavors again. And so I think that Knob Creek, go ahead and put your nose in the glass there. And this is where you're going to want to keep that water handy. I do recommend trying it neat first, as we talked about earlier, and making sure that you get it the way that Fred intends for you to enjoy it, the way that Booker intended you to enjoy it. You know, you really get some of that pecan husk. You get the spiciness coming through, and definitely like the sweetness, the vanilla and the caramel come through. You get a little bit of that marzipan, kind of toasted marshmallow thing happening. And then a lot of times I just like to see if the flavor delivers what the aroma promises, and getting into the flavor a little Knob Creek. This is almost going to start to guarantee that I won't get anything done for the rest of the day, but but in the most delicious way, right? And so feel free to add a couple of drops of water if you would like to, but please do try everything first at bottle strength, and then start to play around with it as you make your way through the pairings. And I think that what we've got coming up with this softer cheese is going to be a great study in comparison and working with flavors that don't necessarily match up exactly the way that we have before, but now start to kind of lean in on some differences, and you'll see how they bring out sweetnesses in each other that I think are really cool. That's Knob Creek.
Right. It is such a rich color. It's really beautiful, and the flavor is there to match. Really enjoying that. Okay, so Willoughby is the next cheese up. Correct, Michael? I'm on.
Yes.
I'm on script here. Okay.
Yeah, sure.
And this is a washed rind cheese. So I mentioned that Highlander had a washed rind, that sort of like rosy hue. Same family, just on different ends of the moisture spectrum. So obviously Highlander is a firmer cheese and Willoughby is in the soft cheese family, but we're doing the same thing to the rind in the cave. We're literally washing it with a little scrub brush, trying to work off the fluffy flora and encourage this community of microbes that I mentioned that's more yeast and bacteria driven. So a symbiotic community of bacteria and yeast. Does that sound familiar to anybody? SCOBY is the acronym. That's what kombucha is made with, right? You make a tea and then you put a mother in it and then it ferments, and instead of getting alcoholic, it gets acidic and flavorful. And so we're kind of making a SCOBY on the surface of this cheese, if you will. Different mix of microbes, but same spirit, and they achieve complexity as with fermented foods and beverages of all kinds. So Willoughby is a pasteurized cheese, as I mentioned, but this is the stinky cheese family. When you wash a rind, you get those funky, bold, sometimes locker room type aromas. If you're not sure what it is that's causing the aroma around you, it might be a little unsettling, but I also like to say the bark is worse than the bite. They usually smell more earthy, and then on the palate, they tend to be a little more sweety, meaty flavors, and also like peaches and cream type flavors. So stone fruits, apricots, peaches are really nice pairings with this style. This is a younger wheel, so we're sort of, we have water everywhere around here, but not a ripe cheese to eat. It can sometimes be hard because it leaves us pretty young and it continues to ripen in the supply chain. So mine is still fairly mild, definitely on that fruity side. You get aromas of peat, which is something that comes up especially in Scotch tasting and other whiskeys. So I'd be interested to hear how peat figures into the bourbon aroma landscape. Suede is on the nose for sure. Sometimes like oniony, beefy, but definitely like new suede shoes sometimes, like in a good way. But then on the palate, like I mentioned, it's sweet, creamy, a little bit like prosciutto-y almost, that sort of like buttery meatiness. That could be an interesting cross pairing, but I'll stay on task here. And I'm gonna go ahead and pair it while we hear about the charcuterie.
So what I chose to pair here was the Sopressa, and kind of like we've been doing, I'll walk you through what the Sopressa is and then kind of get into the specific notes and pairing arrangement that I created here with these other two components. So Sopressa, unlike a lot of the Italian charcuterie that you'll see that really gives ode to either the flavor profile, something like a finocchio being the Italian word for fennel that drives that naming convention, or the specific region that it comes from, a Calabrese giving ode to Calabria, where paprika pepper is going to be common. A Sopressa actually is one of the very few items that is named based on the style. So Sopressa, coming from the Italian root word of squeezed, refers back to an ancient tradition of taking this salami in the casing as it's aging and pressing it between two wooden boards. And so the actual process is what dictates the name, which is why if you're ever looking throughout a grocery store and you're looking for Sopressas, you may have built a specific flavor profile in your mind, but you'll actually get Sopressas that are more indicative of the northern region of Italy. So a Sopressa Veneta, like ours, which is kind of a wine garlic recipe. Or you can get some southern style Sopressas, which are going to be more hot, spicy, because really this is open flavor profile, open to your direction and your innovation and creativity. The only caveat is going to be the production process. And over the years, especially as, you know, kind of producers needed to regulate and really create quality and continuity in production, that wood pressing process has kind of fallen out of favor. But the actual naming convention and the shape that it takes hold from that still remains today. So the Sopressa is actually created with macerated garlic. This is a Sangiovese wine coming from a really beautiful vineyard. The winemaker is Bibi Gratz, who lives in an ancient castle. I was actually fortunate enough to be able to tour this castle that's been in his family for the last 60 years. This is the old, once upon a time when Florence was the capital. This is kind of the primary crown jewel castle. This property has been purchased by Bibi Gratz's family, and he now lives there, runs the vineyard, and creates these beautiful Sangiovese wines. There's something remarkable that happens when you put that fermented Sangiovese wine in with the raw meat and let it re-ferment through the cycle process. It really doesn't bring the flavor of the wine. It really just helps enhance the spices and the meat itself, which really means, you know, a lot of people are afraid like, oh, I would never pair a Sangiovese with a bourbon. But in this case, the flavor enhancement that comes out in that re-fermentation of the Sopressa, along with the garlic and the white pepper and the black pepper, really brought together for me a pairing that was exceptional between the Willoughby, the Sopressa, and then what was actually my favorite standalone drink, which was this Knob Creek bourbon. That was, as I looked at individual components, this was my favorite thing to drink on its own. This was something that really was kind of a champion for me. And then the way that Willoughby and Sopressa kind of brought out the flavors. This is not a blending of flavors coming together in a smooth like the first one. This was an enhancement of different tastes coming together and colliding together. So this was my collision pairing where every component got a little bit better than it was on its own from the three coming together. So this was truly a great pairing for me.
When you put the cheese and the charcuterie together, they blend. I mean, everything comes together. It's a melt of flavors that in there. You know, you think about these three pairings. If you didn't have the bourbon, it's okay, but it's better with the bourbon, because when I add in the bourbon, it brings out all those flavors that are there that I think enhances with it. So, you know, it's a great pairing on its own, but it's even better with the Knob Creek. Adam?
Oh yeah, I think that in reference to the Knob Creek, the spiciness of the Sopressa, right? That's what we're trying to do, Sopressa. Brings out the sweetness of the bourbon. I think that the earthiness, some of that umami kind of beefy flavor that's coming from the cheese also brings out the sweetness of the bourbon. And so when you put all three of them together, they all shine in their own way. And then to have the bourbon be that sweet kind of anchor that works as the medium between all the flavors, in my opinion, is really great. And I think that we're really starting to highlight complexity too, right? Like, even though we had all that wonderful backstory and the finishing that goes into blending Legent, you know, now we just have a really complex bourbon, like a big full body complex bourbon. This cheese is not as showy complex as the blue cheese, but it's got so much going on, and its subtlety and like some of those, you know, when you said suede, I hear you on the suede thing, you know. So I mean, like that, like some of those things that are just kind of wild are really show off. And then I think, Ryan, what you got here with the charcuterie is just, fantastic. I think it's really nice to see how the collision of what you were describing is paying off really well. You know, it's an accident you can't take your eyes off of, and you can't wait to try it.
Zoe?
All right, so that it's really interesting. The Knob Creek on the nose, you're right, that soda and maple aroma hops out of you, the caramely vanilla. But on the palate, I thought it was much drier than I was expecting from those sweet aromas. And it wasn't like sticky or cloying in any way. Sometimes bourbons can feel sweet on the palate. And this was like very balanced, and it felt drier than I would expect. And together with the cheese, it was really lovely. The creaminess of the cheese, you know, kind of was a counterpoint, as we're saying, to the bold beverage. But together, they came together, and I had this like butterscotchy feeling on the palate afterwards, like a Werther's original, right? It's like caramel plus butter.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So that was a win. And then I can't believe I second guessed Brian's pairing choice on the meat side, because because this is perfect. And the aroma on the Sopressa right away, I caught the wine. So I was very validated when you mentioned that it was included. You get those kind of like yeasty fermented notes and the garlic, but the garlic is not overdone. Sometimes that can ruin your palate and just be the most dominant thing. It was lovely, very subtle. And I thought it came together with the cheese in a great way. The cheese, as I mentioned, can be sort of oniony, but it has those allium type aromas. They're thiols, the aroma compounds. They're thiolic. And I thought that they melded in an interesting way while also contrasting. And then all together, the intensities matched up nicely. I would say the creaminess of the cheese is what came through. And then that funk from the rind were like the two characters I was able to, of course, I'm paying attention to what's happening to the cheese throughout the tasting experience. But I didn't, you know, there was harmony and contrast in a way that made for a very balanced pairing.
When you first try the bourbon and the cheese together on their own, like before it kind of fades into that Werther's Originals, there's a really nice fruit pop that happens. And it's, you know, there's fruit in the bourbon, there's fruit in the cheese. You mentioned peaches and cream. I think a lot of fruit that pops out of bourbon can be stone fruits as well. And I think that there's something that happens right there in the very beginning that is fruity and kind of really like that retro nasal sort of fruit in the palate, right? And then as it begins to wash away into that, relying on the strengths of the sweet and the cream, becoming that butterscotch Werther's Original finish is quite nice. But they're great. Like each are great together as twos, and then the trio together is quite nice as well.
You know, a lot of people that are hesitant with wash drying cheeses because of how aromatic they are. I couldn't imagine a better cheese with this pairing. It just works out so well having each of those flavors building upon each other for the final flavor characteristic. And without having the intensity or richness that Willoughby has, it just makes it all work together.
Every time I get to hang out with you, Michael, and eat awesome soft cheeses with Brian's, I just have, my mind goes back to being young and my parents having dinner parties and seeing the soft cheeses and seeing how it's carved out, and like the sad rind just sort of lumped over itself because there's nothing in between it anymore, and thinking that was how you were supposed to eat cheese like that growing up, and of course correcting over my time, but you know, just thinking about all that wasted opportunity for people to enjoy the cheese more than they were enjoying it in those dinner parties from 30 years ago, you know.
I'm glad things changed.
Yes, exactly.
All right,
I'm from a President Brie and like Franzia family, so I'm impressed at your early board.
Ryan, any last comments?
No, just that this one was, I agree that the 2x2s, you know, whether it's charcuterie bourbon, charcuterie cheese bourbon, these 2x2s were really impressive pairings all on their own. And then the three together, what I really loved was it wasn't harmoniously coming together in a smooth, sophisticated way. It was very kind of clash mashup, but extracted all of the very best elements from the Knob Creek, from the Willoughby, from the Sopressa, and that's what I really liked about this pairing. It was very unique and very special for me.
What should we call this one after coming off the Jet Setter?
Oh, I don't know. You guys are better at these names. We'll leave it to Zoe.
We'll think about it.
I'll have it by the end. Yeah.
Got it.
I believe it.
All right. Okay.